Good afternoon, or good morning if you're tuning in from Australia. I'm Charles Edel, Senior Advisor and the Australia Chair here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Moscow initiated the largest conflict in Europe in some 7 decades. Given its scope, its scale, this conflict has had profound implications for how militaries wage war in the 21st century. Mick Ryan's new book, The War for Ukraine, analyzes the war through the twin lenses of strategy and adaptation, detailing how each army has succeeded or failed for the plan for how to adapt to this first 21st century major war. To explore his new book and discuss the lessons military strategists can learn from this war, I'm thrilled to welcome Mick Ryan, Adjunct Fellow with the CSIS Australia Chair, back to yet another CSIS book launch along with my partners in crime, Elliot Cohen and Emily Harding. Now, I say yet another because I think we're getting into something of a habit, because this is not the first, not the second, but indeed the third book launch in 3 years that Mick has undertaken with us. He wrote a book, War Transformed, just as he was transitioning out of the Australian military. He wrote a novel, White Sun War, that we discussed last year, and now we have The War for Ukraine. We're thrilled to have Mick on, a retired Major General in the Australian Army. He's commanded, of course, at various levels, including the brigade and the platoon and the combat level, and he organized Australia's first reconstruction task force in Afghanistan. After a 35-year career with the Australian Army, he transitioned to the Army Reserves as a Major General in 2022. He also happens to have become one of the world's leading authorities on the war in Ukraine and has published widely on the strategic, operational, and tactical elements of this war. He's traveled to Ukraine 4 times since the beginning of the war and is here to share his insights, along, of course, with my colleague Elliot Cohen, the Arleigh Burke Chair in Strategy. Elliot is here at CSIS, having come from a storied career as a strategist across the academic, the political, and the academic administrative realms. He's written widely on strategic issues, including the Hollow Crown and Big Stick, and most recently, and I want to make sure that everyone make sure to read his most recent report co-authored with Phillips O'Brien, The Russia-Ukraine War, a study in strategic failure. Which
Analytic failure.
Analytic failure, which I'm sure we'll get into a bit in the conversation here. Also joined by our colleague Emily Harding, the Deputy Director of the International Security Program.
Yes, although we have a new name.
That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, we are now the Defense and Security Department. So even better than we were before.
Emily also, of course, is the Director of the Intelligence, National Security and Technology Program here at CSIS. She leads a broad team working on intelligence, working across the technology space. I'm thrilled to have the band back together here. We have a lot to discuss, the evolving strategies of the two sides, the call for adaptation, how both sides have integrated technologies into how they've gone about the war. But as Mick says in the book too, this is a snapshot. It's only a partial story of the war because we're not at the beginning, we're certainly not at the end of this war, and the book had to be published at some point. So this really takes us from the invasion in February 2022 straight through the launch of last year's counteroffensive by the Ukrainians. So Mick, would like to just start things off before we get into a round robin and really an open discussion amongst the 4 of us. Can you just start us by talking us through why you decided to write this book as your 3rd one, but more importantly, you're sitting down there in Brisbane. So why would an Australian decide to focus on this conflict and one that is seemingly so far away from Australia?
Yeah, thanks, Charles. It's great to be with all 3 of you again. I feel like I've achieved a hat trick, which in cricket is 3 wickets and 3 balls with these 3 conversations over 3 years. And I'm deeply appreciative of the support from CSIS over that time, not just with these, but with the wonderful camaraderie and collegiate working environment that you guys have and I've had in a small way with you. So why would someone on the other side of the world care about the war in Ukraine? The short answer is Ukraine matters to all of us. It isn't just a regional conflagration. It isn't just some spat between neighbours. This is a war that has profound consequences for how democracies see themselves and see themselves working together in the 21st century. This isn't just about military affairs and learning about warfare in the 21st century. This is a bigger concern. This is about war and the conflict between authoritarians and democracies, as well as those who watch on from the cheap seats in the global south. And that matters to Australia because we also have a big predatory authoritarian in our region who's also looking at its neighbours, and we need to do everything we can to deter them from doing something catastrophic.
If you don't mind, one of the things when you talk about the international repercussions, the lessons that people might learn, I know that we're going to talk about this and tackle this from a number of different angles. But when I used to teach up in Newport at the U.S. Naval War College, when Elliot taught there, I suspect, some years before me too, we used to discuss some challenges about lessons learned from conflicts. That first of all, it's not like people are simply just writing down the lessons that they have on 3x5 note cards, and if they do, it's not as if they're scattered around the battlefield for folks to pick up and learn. So one of the things I found really interesting distinction at the outset of the book, you talked about the difference between lessons and lessons learned for strategic cultures. Can you just peel that back a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lesson, or even before that, an observation is someone looking at something happen and goes, oh, well, isn't that interesting? A lesson is something that's recorded and is subject to a little bit of analysis. A lesson learned is a very different thing because that is something that an institution has absorbed and it's adapted, its doctrine, its training, its leadership models, its procurement policies because of that lesson. So there is a very significant difference between a lesson and a lesson learned. The US Army has very good doctrinal definitions of these, and generally I find that a pretty good distinction.
Yeah, my military friends will often joke about the difference between a lesson observed and a lesson learned. You can observe a lesson and then not learn anything from it and not incorporate it at all. Pulling on that thread, Mick, one of the things that you were talking about in the book is that a military that is doing its job is learning and adapting and incorporating during peacetime. And I think that's a very important message for the U.S. government in particular and the Pentagon. We spend a lot of time talking about what we've learned from the war in Ukraine and how they've done really amazing things with innovation, how they've used technology in brand new ways, how they're really trying to iterate quickly on the battlefield. And while all of that is amazing and sounds phenomenal, we have not yet seen the U.S. military establishment figure out how to do that here with the same urgency during peacetime. So talk a little bit about that during peacetime. These are the lessons that you observe, these are the lessons that you learn, and how you actually get from that little 3x5 index card that Charlie was talking about to actually implementing change.
Yeah, one of the observations I guess I'd make of the war is that neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians went into this war totally free of kind of adaptive processes. Both had been undergoing long processes of reform in the lead up to the war, which had kind of exercised their adaptive muscles. They'd been training themselves to learn and adapt, perhaps at different qualities and different speeds if you compare both Russia and Ukraine. But they went into this war with an adaptive stance that allowed them to begin learning early, particularly with the Ukrainians. Now, that's not a perfect approach. It's pretty uneven in both sides. But essentially, if you can, in peacetime, develop the leadership culture, the analytical framework, and the linkages between tactical lessons and changing things at the institutional and strategic levels, you'll be very well paced for the shock of the first month or the first year of any war that comes up and be able to learn more quickly, to share lessons laterally more quickly, and to absorb them into institution more quickly so that your industry, your policy people, your training and education people can continuously adapt and generate advantage over your enemy.
So, Mick, it's always great to be with you. I want to, if Charlie will let me ask two questions. The first really has to do with something that I think about as an observer and occasional commentator on this war, which is what is observable and what is not observable? You know, in any war in history, there is always stuff that you learn 10, 20, sometimes 30 or 40 years later, where you go, oh, if I had known that, I would have probably thought about this war rather differently than I did at the time. So I was wondering if you could just begin by sketching out what are the things that are kind of knowable, what are the things that we know are out. I mean, it's the Rumsfeld thing, isn't it? You know, the knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. Could you just ramble a little bit on that?
Yeah, I think I kind of make this caveat in the first line of the book that this is part of a story of part of a war. There's so many things we don't see while a war is going on. We may see large parts of different battles. We may see the public statements of different leaders and the public meetings of leaders. Although I would also say that we are not in an environment where the battlefield is transparent, as many have said. It's getting that way, but it is not transparent. Because we can't see into the hearts and souls of human beings. We can't see their motivations. We can't see their morale on a internet live feed. But other things we can't see, you know, there's obviously a huge amount of intelligence that's generated and used in a war. And we often don't see that for years afterwards. In some respects, decades. I mean, the Allies' use of electronic warfare really wasn't revealed fully until the 1970s. We don't see a lot of the interactions that occur at the politico-military interface. You know, that civil-military crisis we saw in Ukraine over December, January. I'm sure there's lots more to be revealed about that when Zaluzhny and Zelensky write their memoirs. So there's all these things in the background, and they're almost exclusively human that we either never see or we don't see for many years later. And when we do see them years later, as you said, Elliot, they do change how we look at the war. I'm sure that will happen with this conflict in the years to come.
Yeah.
Can I actually, before your second question, sure, Elliot, because we did highlight the study that you've just come out with,
yep,
a study in analytic failure. Here we weren't talking about the Russians' initial assessment, but we were talking about Western observers of this. Mick just highlighted the idea about exclusively human factors that are obscured for us right now. Can you just walk us through the conclusions that you have about why so many Western observers at the outset of this war got it wrong?
Well, I mean, it really dovetails with what Mick was just saying. I mean, people were looking, they were counting pieces of equipment, they were looking at formal doctrine, they were looking at the things that were readily observable. What they were not looking at was even things like levels of training, which should have been a little bit more observable, but, you know, things like corruption, for example, in the case of the Russians, or will to fight, or kind of evolutions in command structures and so on. These were the things which were essentially human. And I think that's a really powerful thing for all of us to remember when you're looking at a pre-conflict or a conflict situation. It is, as you know, Mick has pointed out in this book and in other books, it's ultimately a very human activity. And that means it's not like an engineering project. And it's not simply about the hardware. It's about a lot of other things. So, Mick, let me ask you this, or let me actually begin by saying something, which is, I follow you very closely on your Substack, and not just because we're friends, but because you're unusual in that the way you're approaching this war is as a student of war, a student of military art and science, a student of conflict, of military organizations. Most of the analysis that tends to be done, that most of us consume, not from your Substack, either is from people who have been Russia analysts, for the most part, which is not the same thing as being a military analyst, or journalists who are on the front lines. And as my friend Tom Ricks, who used to be the military correspondent of the Washington Post, said, it's dangerous to cover combat, but it's pretty straightforward in a way to kind of show people what's going on. What's harder is the kind of analytic look, stepping back, taking the analytic look at the operational level of war, for example, and seeing some of the bigger things that are going on. And as you and I were discussing in the green room here, it's one of the ways in which the commentators in World War II were in many ways actually better than what we have now in a lot of our news organizations. all that's a long wind up to the question, which is, stepping back, what do you think are some of the bigger operational or technical developments in warfare in this war that people have not really remarked on adequately? I've got my own list, but I'd really like to hear yours.
Yeah, I think that there's a few of them. I've actually just pitched an article to Foreign Affairs that look at this topic. I think one of the big things that most people always miss is that there's far more continuity than change in this war. That most of the lessons, most of the observations we're seeing are actually old ones relearned. Things like the necessity for good leadership, at the strategic, the political and the tactical level. That's a really big deal and can be central to the outcome of a war. Things like having a robust defence industry that can build enough things in a war of consumables. So there's some really old lessons that we've relearned that I don't see enough focus on, because most wars are an aggregation of everything that's gone before them, plus one or two new things. In this war, the one or two new things, I think, first and foremost, would be this absolute Cambrian explosion in the use of autonomous systems, not just in the air, primarily in the air, because the aerial environment's the easiest one to operate in. But you've seen this great expansion in the maritime and ground domains as well. And that has been accompanied, I think, by a really significant and continuing development in the use of different AIs, both on weapon platforms, but also to help humans make decisions, to prioritise things like air defence, to help with war crimes analysis, to assist with logistics and things like this. So I think, in this war, it's largely a story of many, many old lessons relearned, plus a couple of new ones layered over the top, like icing on a chocolate cake.
So I'm going to push that a little bit farther, Mick. As you know, my program looks a lot at future technologies, emerging technologies, and how they intersect with intelligence work and with war. And you say, there's a very interesting line at the beginning of the book where you say, artillery, often described as the king of battle, has reasserted its place in the contemporary battlefield as the most prolific killer of all weapons used. Industrial scale warfare, with massive use of autonomous systems and munitions, has become the norm. And to me, that is that combination of the old lesson plus the new, and the new being the autonomous system. So say a little bit about how autonomy has really changed this battlefield, and then if I could, ask you to prognosticate a bit about, the next version of this book that you write in a year or in 2 years. Can you see a near future where there is no longer a human in the loop for those autonomous systems? And at what point do we get there?
Well, I think to start at the beginning of that question, when you look at artillery remains the biggest killer on the battlefield, but autonomous systems certainly do their own share of it. But it's the combination of the two that I think we've seen really significant steps in. Now, it's not like we haven't used drones to call in artillery before. We've done it for decades. But we've seen it at a scale in this war that we've just never seen before. And it's not just drones for calling in artillery or HIMARS as part of a more effective kill chain. I mean, drones work with tanks now. So tanks will be, behind a hill firing indirect using them. So what we're seeing is a combined arms system that isn't replaced with drones, but it's augmented and enhanced with drones and electronic warfare to speed up the tempo of war at the tactical level, to enhance its lethality. And that's driving changes in tactics that we've seen throughout the war, that we'll continue to see, and that we really need to be learning in the West, because those changes in tactics will drive changes in training and education models. They will changes in what different battlefield organisations look like. An infantry platoon in 5 years will look very different to what one looks like now because of autonomous systems and the connectivity provided with digitised command and control systems that the Ukrainians have really leveraged. Does that mean eventually that we'll see an empty battlefield, that we will see very few humans or humans entirely taken out of the decision chain? I don't think so. for a couple of reasons. Firstly, humans make a lot of mistakes, but so do computer programs. I mean, there's no such thing as a perfect AI. And one of the things that AI and decision-making lacks is empathy. It doesn't possess any ethical kind of concerns. It just does what it's told, and humans do. And I think that is a really important part of war. At the end of the day, what humans do on the battlefield must reflect what humans in their society believe in. AI, I don't think, can do that. So I don't think we'll ever entirely remove humans from the battlefield or from decisions about killing other human beings, but AI will certainly play a far more important role.
If you don't mind, just for people who are watching this, I want to talk about the book's organization a little bit, because that allows us to dig into not only the adaptation piece, which you've been talking about, Mick, but you chose to break this down into two different sections, right? Kind of analysis of the strategy of both red and blue and helpers, and then a look at the adaptations and the systems that are set in place for those. Can you both kind of sketch, why did you do it like that, but then walk us through a little bit of what you saw, kind of not only the strategies, but some of the assumptions that were underlying and driving both Moscow and Kyiv?
Yeah, firstly, I didn't just want to do a chronological look at the war for a couple of reasons. Firstly, a lot of people have already done that. But secondly, as Elliot said, there's so many unknowns, even in a chronology, that I just thought, well, that's maybe at this point of the war not the right approach to take. So I picked out what I thought were the two big elements that provide the context for a lot of the things we see. And the approach I've taken in analysing and writing about the war is not write about what happens, but write about, well, why might that have happened? What's the context for that action or series of actions, and what might the medium-term or longer-term impacts of that might be? And that really takes you into the realms of strategy and into the realms of learning and adaptation. So they were the two big areas I wanted to focus on. But when it comes to strategy, I think there's a lot of lessons about strategy, but one of the big ones for me is about the assumptions that underpin strategies. And for me, one of the great case studies is the assumptions that Putin made about his 10-day strategy for this war. He made three really big assumptions that underpinned his strategy. The first was that the Ukrainians would be very similar to those they faced in 2014 that wouldn't fight. The second one was that the Ukrainian government was weak and would probably flee or fall. And the third one was that NATO wouldn't intervene significantly. And he had a fairly reasonable basis for that assumption, because they hadn't really done much every other time Russia had intervened around the world. So he made those three assumptions, and he got all three wrong. And when you get the key assumptions to your strategy wrong, generally that means your strategy's bad, as we saw at the start of this war. So, that's a very quick snapshot of why I looked at strategy and adaptation. But, getting your assumptions right, testing your assumptions constantly is a really important part of good strategy making and strategy execution.
Can I throw this out to everyone at the table? Because we started to talk about the human element, about how we humans make errors, humans make judgments all the time, but these three key assumptions that Mick was talking about, that Putin was likely to face the same Ukraine that he did in 2014, that the government would capitulate, would fall, would collapse on day 1 to 5, and that the Western bloc, NATO in particular, wouldn't support Ukraine in its struggle. Why were those wrong?
Well, first, one thing I would stipulate is it wasn't just Putin who made
Correct.
those incorrect assumptions. So did the entire Western analytic community. Right. And even in some measure, I'll sign up to some of that myself. So there's I think an even larger question than why did just Putin sign up for that. I mean, my interpretation of Putin, who obviously was much further over than anybody else, was it has to do with his perception of Ukraine in history. Ukraine is a part of Russia. I mean, he wrote this long article on the historical unity of the Russian and Ukrainian peoples. It's terrible history, as somebody like Timothy Snyder of Yale would tell you, but he absolutely believed in it. The thing I find more concerning, I don't know if you agree with this or not, Mick, is why did we buy off on that? Because, we shouldn't be the ones who believe the kind of, ultranationalist stuff that he believes in. So why did we believe it?
No less that we were training the Ukrainian military from 2014 onwards.
Right, and now some of those trainers did not have that view of what was going to happen, but still, I think that's why it's an issue for us. It's not just an issue for the Russians. Would you agree with that, Mick?
No, I totally agree. I mean, Putin has been constantly telling a story to us about Russia and Russia's part in the world. And he's been using misinformation, influence operations around the world, not just in Ukraine or Russia, but in Western Europe and the United States to support that story. Tom Friedman wrote an op-ed last week that I read, and he said, in the modern world, you've got to win the war and win the story. Mm-hmm. And Putin, as well as President Xi in China, are very focused on winning the story. And they put a lot of effort into both open and behind the scenes influence operations in democracies and in their neighbours to win that story of what their countries are, what their country's trajectory is in the 21st century, and why democracies shouldn't and can't stand in their way. Now, we should be smart enough and better educated than to constantly believe this story that they roll out. But unfortunately, many in our societies are not well educated enough or too susceptible to the kind of influence operations that Russia and China are running out. And that's why, countries like Taiwan and Ukraine are really fighting for their lives at the moment. They may not be in a hot war like Ukraine is, but they're certainly up against it because of this storytelling by authoritarians.
Yeah, I'll just say, for me, the troubling part is our expert community also bought off on it. And whether how much of that is influence operations, part of it I think is. But I think there are other things. And, I think one of the useful things about this book is it should be a stimulus to some self-reflection as well about a whole bunch of things, including things that we believe about war. I've got a question about that I'd like to. So one of the, this will take us a little bit off topic, but you talked about the return of industrial warfare as one of the big lessons. And of course, none of the Western countries were prepared for the kind of mass production of consumables, particularly munitions, that a real war entailed. That in itself is shocking. It is one of the lessons of this war, do you think, for Western countries, including Australia, including the United States, is that in the modern era, the kind of highly professional military that Australia has, that the United States has, composed of well-paid, well-compensated, well-cared-for volunteers, just as the Brits would say, not fit for purpose. We walked away from the mass army, and you look at the casualty figures in this war. Russians maybe 600,000. The British intelligence estimates. Nobody's quite sure about the Ukrainians. For sure, it's in the six figures. How is that one of the things that we're going to have to rethink in a really serious way, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I've been doing a bit of work on mobilization over the last little while, and I think one of the key findings these days is that the all-volunteer force is no longer fit for purpose. That doesn't mean we don't want volunteers who are professional. You always want that as part of the really strong core of a military organisation. But there are two really significant problems with the all-volunteer force at the moment, beyond the fact that we thrashed it to death so the rest of society could stay away from or keep at arm's length from the Iraq and Afghanistan war. That's a separate issue. But one of the two issues are, firstly, we can't recruit enough people anymore. Every Western military institution is having very significant problems with recruiting enough people into their all-volunteer forces. And secondly, the scale of likely challenges over the coming decade, not just potential warfare, but the potential responses to large-scale natural catastrophes means that we need bigger military organisations. So we need to shift to a model that embraces part professional, part reserve and part conscripted or national service people in a military organisation. Now, unfortunately, in some democracies, UK, Australia, even the United States, conscription or national service is a dirty phrase. I think that's a tragedy because in many other democracies, national service is entirely unremarkable and seen as a good thing for societies. We're going to have to flip our mindsets, and we're going to have an approach where we are better at joining our young people to their society, and national service is a good way to do that.
Can I jump in right here? Because we can say that clearly in Ukraine, let's start with Ukraine, this war, which is an existential war, has generated that sense of urgency, that sense of production, that sense of creativity that it's needed there. We can probably begin to expand that circle outwards and point to the Baltics, some of the changes that we've seen up there, the expansion of NATO. But throughout this book, I mean, Elliot, you were just talking about kind of national mobilization. We're talking about industrial capacity. Again, this is a question outside the military domain, but I'm curious to get everyone's thoughts about why this war, the biggest war that we've seen in Europe since World War II, has not generated outside of Ukraine and maybe the Baltics, as much good as it's done for NATO, that sense of national urgency.
I mean, my view would be that part of that is because there is lingering what Mick and I were talking about. That is the sense that Ukraine is kind of like part of Russia. So this is like the Russians fighting in Chechnya. I mean, maybe it's terrible, maybe it's awful, but this isn't a direct attack on us now, or a potential direct attack on us. That is, even now, that is changing. For sure, it's not the Baltics. For sure, the Poles. I would say the Scandinavians. You know, if they're not doing it fast enough, but they are ramping up conscription. I was just in Norway, and they are increasing the size of their military. They're, you know, at the moment it's a draft-induced volunteering, and they've begun to worry a little bit what happens when you're drafting people who really don't want to go. But I think for Western publics, for a whole bunch of reasons, including the way in which political leaders have explained this to their publics, there isn't that sense of urgency. It's beginning to creep in. Like even in Germany, you know, when the head of German intelligence is saying, you know, there's a good chance that we'll be attacked by the Russians by 2030. That's pretty dramatic.
Yeah.
It's I'd go back to this thing about winning the story. The authoritarians are good at storytelling. Western politicians are awful at it. You know, Western politicians have lost the art of having difficult conversation with their publics. They pander to them and tell them what they want to hear. But Western politicians, I don't think anymore, are very good at telling their publics what they need to hear. And this is something they need to hear.
It's funny, as warfare has become less and less a matter of geography, this war has been highly geographic focused. If you're on the outskirts of Russia and on the outskirts of Ukraine, I think they feel this at a very visceral level. I was in Finland, you talk to the Finns, boy, they feel this, and they are operating in a lot of solidarity with the Ukrainians. You've been to Poland many times, we've talked to our Polish colleagues, they feel it on a very visceral level. And what fascinates me about the debate in the United States is that there is this complete misapprehension that a fight in Ukraine is a distraction from a potential fight in the Pacific with China, when they actually could not be much more linked. I mean, if anything, a victory in Ukraine makes deterrence in the Pacific far more real. Yes. Makes it more likely that we win a future conflict in the Pacific, if God forbid one ever happens. And there's this constant dialogue, this losing of the story that you're talking about, Mick, in the US, where some politicians, for their own purposes, want to tell a story that, you know, we shouldn't be spending money on Ukraine and we need to save it for the Pacific. And that is as far from the truth as you could actually get on it. So I think we need to do a better job, those who look at foreign policy, in explaining why this matters. But you see things like, the Brits sending, freedom of navigation operations into the Pacific. We talk about our European colleagues who are heavily invested in what's going on in the Pacific because they know these things are linked.
The people who understand it best are the Taiwanese.
Yeah.
When there was a small group of us went to Taiwan, and I think one of the things that even surprised all of us is the most senior leadership of Taiwan was saying, look, we know we've got $14 billion worth of arms sales that you guys haven't delivered yet. If you need to give them first to the Ukrainians, that's okay, because that war is really important for us. And Mick, you've been to Taiwan quite a bit, and I suspect you've heard something very similar there.
Yeah, the Taiwanese have watched the war in Ukraine extraordinarily closely. And, if you speak to senior decision makers and ministers and deputy ministers, they all tell you that of all the lessons they learned, the most important one is will. You have to demonstrate the capacity to help yourself before anyone will help you. And I think that's a really important part of how the previous and the newly inaugurated Taiwanese president is seeing the world at the moment. Not only do they have to do something to help themselves, they need to be seen to be doing it if they expect others to help them. That all comes down to the will of government and the will of the people.
It's interesting, as the war has unfolded, you've heard this conversation dressed up basically, but stating this language, that we are so keenly watching what's happening in Ukraine in the Indo-Pacific because we see it basically as a dress rehearsal, both for will, for mobilization, and for how it might play out and who might join and aid us. It's the Taiwans, but it's also the Japanese who have been a force in Europe. It's Canberra occasionally on this too. And one of the questions that you leave us with, Mick, and I'd love to get into a conversation of this, is we're talking about lessons learned from the tactical up to the operational, to the theater, to the strategic, eventually to the international and the political. And we can talk about how Western democracies might have to adapt, but there are others who are watching this too. Yes, the Taiwans, but you bet in Beijing. We're actively aiding the war effort too. And as good of a story as we can tell ourselves, if we want to, about the mobilization of a coalition and about helping Ukraine to resist, there's an alternative version of the story that you could tell that I'm sure is being told in Beijing, amongst others, that the initial invasion didn't happen fast enough. There wasn't a decapitation effort that succeeded. Yep. They didn't down the storytelling abilities. Starlink was not brought down immediately, and the nuclear saber rattling was good but could have been better. I'm just curious, for everyone, Mick, maybe we'll start with you, about as adversaries, potential adversaries are watching this too, what do you think is the story that they're telling themselves about this ongoing conflict?
Well, I think all those things you mentioned are on the money. I think what the Chinese will be telling themselves is that this is more evidence of Western decline, that Western Europe and the United States haven't stood up because they're not able to, both morally and industrially. And I think that's an important story that Xi's been telling about the East is rising and the West is in decline. But I also think it's a story the Chinese tell about Western countries interfering with the affairs of others. So I think they're two important parts. But if there's one major lesson that I think Xi and his small and increasingly smaller circle of advisors are learning from this, is they've learned how we make political and strategic decisions in the West. And I think they would be leaning back with a wry smile on their face, thinking they've got us, they've got our measure. They understand how we make decisions. They understand that we have become very strategically timid and easily terrified by a nuclear saber rattling, and that they will be using that. We should be in no doubt in the years ahead.
So I'll jump in here a little bit. On BBC this morning, BBC World News, they had an interview that some brave reporter went out into a park in Beijing and was asking folks, who do you think should win the U.S. election? And the rationale was fascinating. But no matter who they asked and no matter who they said they wanted to win the election, it came back to, but both of them are attacking China. Both of them are trying to keep China down and preventing China from rising. And I was thinking to myself, what? Like, that is not at all what we are attempting to do, we in the United States. It works out best for everybody if China peacefully rises and gets wealthy along with the rest of the globe. So what do we need to do to tell that story and to win that story and find a path through to a prosperous future for everyone? So that's a clear window into one thing, that the Chinese are telling themselves about the way that the West is approaching this conflict and conflicts around the world. I also suspect that Xi Jinping is also asking a lot of questions about corruption in his own forces and seeing what that corruption did to gut the Russian capabilities. And we know that he has been pursuing anti-corruption efforts within his own ranks at a rather extreme level and continues that. So trying to root out that kind of rot would be important. And then one final thing that I really hope is a conversation they're not having, and that is, are our intel forces telling us the truth? One thing that we saw with Russia was that clearly the Russian intel forces were lying to Putin about what was possible in Ukraine and what was going to happen in Ukraine. If Xi Jinping is really, in a questioning mood and wants to question, are you telling me the truth, or are you too afraid that you're going to be, cast out of the inner circle if you give me bad news? A country cannot learn these lessons. They cannot succeed. They cannot strategize. They cannot fight if they aren't being honest with themselves. So, on that note, I hope that China's not.
Can I just jump in there? I know we've got to finish shortly, but on a note of optimism, the fact that two people in a park in Beijing are interested and care about who the US president is says something about the enduring power of the United States. I think how China has acted during this war, even though they're happy for this war in Ukraine to continue because it distracts the US, they have been very hesitant to upset the United States, particularly with things like SWIFT payments. So I think this goes to the enduring economic power of the United States, the enduring international power of the United States with things like NATO and its relationships in Asia. So I think there's a lot of things the United States can do to support Ukraine and do it more quickly, but also deter war in the Pacific. It really is just about, is the next administration willing to do those things with the power that it still retains?
I would add on to that, one of the stories that you can see being narrated in one of two different ways in Beijing, both good and bad, is that the West actually hasn't totally forgotten about coalition building and the power that it can muster alongside allies and partners who are committed to a certain outcome. We talk about economic power, we talk about economic heft, we talk about economic throw weight. We can also talk about the fact that those sanctions haven't come on quick enough, fast enough, nor has the arming of Ukraine. But you can see that this story can play out in one of two ways. On the one hand, there's a little bit of caution here. The number of allies and partners who can be brought to the fight is larger than we thought. The caution, I think, clearly from our point of view, I think, is that it tends to move in piecemeal increments as opposed to leaps and bounds.
Yeah, I suspect that the Chinese are also frequently find themselves surprised by the United States. We tend to forget what a surprising country we are. And I don't think that I think they expected that the Russians would be much more successful. I don't think they expected the level of support that we've given the Ukrainians. I think they were surprised. They've probably been surprised by our ability to sustain it. And they're probably surprised, if I had to guess, by the fact that you now have the Japanese and the South Koreans, to a lesser extent, unfortunately, I would say Australia, playing a significant role. I mean, the Polish military is buying over 1,000 South Korean tanks. Guess who they plan to use them on?
3 million shells.
Right. And so, I think everybody is wrestling with a rather uncertain world.
Yeah. Look, I'm not sure if it's an optimistic or pessimistic way, but I know that the way that we close out these conversations every time is we have 4 inveterate readers around the table, not just of Mick Ryan's books, but kind of much broader than that. So I'd be, for my own personal knowledge and edification, curious for a go around the horn about what everyone is reading, serious books get you no points here. Elliot, you start us off.
No, I'm afraid it's going to be serious. So I am reading this massive trilogy by a British historian named N.A.M. Roger, which is really a history of British sea power. I'm in the middle of the second volume called Command of the Ocean, which is British naval power from 1649 to 1815. It's a magnificent piece of history, truly magnificent. And it does get you thinking, because the British absolutely did not have it all their own way throughout this period. They were And there are ways in which it is somewhat reminiscent of the American situation today. And it gives you things to think about. But it's also just a fantastic read.
Mick?
I'm actually reading an advanced copy of Hal Brand's next book, The Eurasian Century. So far, it's a tremendous book, as you would expect from Hal. And it really, I think, offers some pretty good insights for strategists and policymakers.
Well, on the less serious front, I just finished Shogun. Finally, it took me forever. That book is
James
enormous.
Clavell.
Yes, but it was quite good. I thought. Talk about a study in a culture and the leadership was fascinating. But I just began Phil O'Brien's book, The Strategists, which looks at Churchill, Stalin, Mussolini, Roosevelt, and Hitler. And I think the tagline is something like how they were made and how they made war. And as a former leadership analyst, what I really love about this book is that he goes deep on the backgrounds of all these men and what formed them and their views about life and about warfare. And there's just so much richness there. And like I said, as a former leadership analyst, this is always what you look at first. Like, how is this person interpreting this situation? Not just what are the external events, but how are they seeing it through their lens? Because it matters.
And you, Charlie?
Well, now I've been pulled up into seriousness level, so I'll give you somewhat serious level. I am deep in the midst of Upton Sinclair's 11-novel Lanny Budd series. This has totally dropped off everyone's radar. The third one won the Pulitzer Prize in 1945, I believe. Sigmund Freud, amongst others, said and Albert Einstein blurbed the book, saying if you want to understand the history of our times, I go to Upton Sinclair. It follows this one character, Lanny Budd, who's the son of a dissolute beauty and a merchant of death, an arms dealer. And he is born in France, but he follows the 20th century from World War I really up to World War II, where it takes off. He ends up, he's quite a debonair gentleman. He's an art dealer, but all that is a cover for being FDR's man of action on the continent. It's fun. They're really long, but what it gives you, I'm up to book number 7 here, is not only the contending ideological streams of the 20th century, really getting into capitalism and communism, but at a more tactical level, because he's an everyman and he goes everywhere, and that's why he's so valuable to FDR, gives you the intricate politics amongst the French, multiple governments, at this time, how they're dealing with the reforming of their own politics, what's happening in Russia, what's happening in Nazi Germany. He goes in multiple times. It's really just a fantastic read that unfortunately has totally dropped off everyone's radar. So I leave that, although because Mick has been nice enough to tune in really early in the morning in Brisbane, I do want to give a plug to my new favorite author, Trent Dalton, who's an Aussie journalist, now a novelist. His newest book, it's just fiction, but they are so wonderful. Lola in the Mirror is a tribute to your city, Mick, if you haven't yet read it. It's just a beautiful book about how people who come from the most unassuming of origins can overcome them. So I would recommend that to you if you haven't yet read it. But at this point, I know we're about at time here. We could probably go on for a while, and we can, because we'll go here next year when we take Mick's 4th book and maybe 5th book in quick succession too. So from all of us,
no pressure.
Mick, I know you've already written it, so we're just looking for the title at this point. But thanks so much for joining us. Elliot and Emily, thanks for joining in the conversation. And for everyone at home watching, thanks so much for joining us. And plug into all the events that are happening and at csis.org. Thanks very much.